Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and welcome to the Political Postbox, which is a weekly look at some of the more engaged with comments that appear on videos on this channel from the last week. And we'll get straight on to the first one when that little box goes away. So, longish one. It says, since the election, I've noticed on this channel, as well as Maximilian Robespierre, an apparent increase in Leavers coming on to demand that Remainers stop expressing their opinion. I have noticed this too. It says they seem to be genuinely outraged and that this isn't happening, as if it's Remainers still existing is sort of cheating. I find it striking that they seem more angry now that they've won. I'm not sure why this is, but I have a couple of ideas. I have an idea as well. We'll go through these. One, they're anxious about whether Brexit really will be a success, or they thought that Brexit being a success would make them feel less anxious or alienated, and it hasn't. Rather than admit this, they vent their feelings as anger at Remainers. I don't think it's that. From this particular group, obviously Remainers, sort of in Leavers, large diverse group, but we're talking about specifically the ones who do, yes, come on this channel and others and get really angry at the fact that we're still not accepting it. We're accepting it's happening, we're just not accepting it's a good idea. Two, they thought that politics would work like a movie where victory is total and final. Once the Death Star blows up, the rebels win everywhere and everyone cheers. So it didn't really happen, did it? Because straight after we had another Death Star, and then a whole planet that was a Death Star, and then more recently a whole fleet of ships that were individual Death Stars. But yeah. There isn't a pro-Empire opposition and the support of roughly half the galaxy that isn't going anywhere and won't even admit that they're the bad guys. Neither option bodes well for the future, either for these individuals or the UK as a whole. It implies that if Brexit doesn't go well, they might prefer to accuse Remainers of sabotaging Britain. Oh yeah, they'll be doing that. Rather than re-examine their enthusiasm for Brexit. Now, for the particular group you're talking about, the particular group, these are the ones who are really angry at Remainers for still being Remainers. And, in a month's time will be rejoiners, and they'll be really angry at that as well. This is what I think, based on the comments I've been reading. They're not Leavers because they think Brexit is a great idea. For them, I'll tell you what, I'll go through my thought process on this. Imagine the scenario. So imagine you're a Leave supporter. You really believe Brexit is going to be best for Britain. It's going to be everything that was promised. Everything that was promised. And it's going to be immediate. The effects are going to be immediate. We're going to see in a year or two just how amazing it is. Okay, let's say you're of that mindset. And let's say there's a fellow Briton who is utterly convinced that it's going to be terrible. What would you naturally do? What you'd naturally do is go, don't worry, I know you're anxious, but you'll see in a couple of years' time, it'll all be fantastic. In other words, that British Remainer hasn't lost. From your point of view, they haven't lost. They've won. They just don't realise it yet. In the same way that I view a Leaver as someone who hasn't won. They've lost. They just don't see it yet. You know what I mean? There'd be no anger. It would just be, well, you are going to see. You are going to find out. So for these people, it's not about Brexit. It's about the argument. They found themselves, for whatever reason, on a particular side of an argument. And the argument is all that matters. That's why they're angry. Because they're just like an internet, debater, arguer, whatever you want to call them. Not always trolls, that's not fair. But, someone who's arguing on the internet, they're just really angry that from their point of view, they think they've won. Why isn't this other person accepting that I've won the argument? Because that's all they want to do. They just want to win the argument. They don't care about Brexit. They don't care whether it's better for the country or worse for the country at this point. At some point, maybe they did. That's why they adopted that particular side of the argument. But now, it's all that's left. All that is left is winning the argument. And it does, I think, just frustrate them that there are still people going, no, this is a really terrible idea. Really dreadful. And I think it's as simple as that. I don't think it's that these are people who are now having second thoughts. They may or may not be. That's irrelevant. That's not why they're angry on here, I don't think. It's purely and simply because they just have this argument. They think they won this argument. any of them that are actually intelligent and reasoned know that they haven't really won the argument, because they know full well that Brexit is now going to happen because of a minority of the country voting for the Conservatives. They know that the polls have been saying that a majority of the country would vote to remain were there to be another referendum. They know these things. So they know they haven't really won the argument. They've just won the cause, if you like. They've won the battle, the war maybe even. But what they want to do is win the argument. But anyway, that's my thoughts on that. On to the next one. Says, what really winds me up about my fellows who want to leave is that we are constantly insulting our neighbours, Scotland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Spain. I haven't actually heard too many people insulting the Dutch, but obviously, you know, different pockets of the country will have their different attitudes towards the outsiders. Because this is what ultimately Brexit is about. And I'm sorry to those who voted leave and it had nothing to do with that. It did for an awful lot of people. And that is why both campaigns pushed that narrative, keep the outsiders out narrative. That's why they pushed it, because they knew those were the people that were essentially supporting them. Just because there were others supporting them for whatever other reasons doesn't mean that's what it was mostly about. Spain, are those same people rude to their next door neighbours in England as well? The price of that is stone cold neighbourhood nastiness and no joy. I'll answer that first bit to begin with. It's actually quite weird. It's difficult to know from an anecdotal point of view, because I don't come across too many people who express these views. Even now, where it's quite clear in the country at large, in the UK at large, there are a lot more people more emboldened to express, you know, frankly racist views. And, you know, oddly, I remember when I was growing up, I didn't come across my first racist until I was 18. Now, I'm not saying I had never met anyone who wasn't a racist until I was 18. That's clearly untrue. There's quite a lot of it about. But what obviously had happened is that until I was 18, I'd never come across anyone who expressed any racist views that I recognised as being racist at any rate. Hopefully that doesn't mean to say that I was racist and just ignored them. But then when I was 18, I came across someone who was. You know, they're expressing these views. I thought this is very, very odd. And I think it's because, and this was in the 80s, it was much less acceptable in the 90s and then in the noughties. And I think it was just because people were aware that these views, although they might have people they associate with and they can, in private, express these views and tell these jokes, that they knew they couldn't do it out in public. So I never heard anyone expressing these views until I was 18. And very few since, I have to say. And, you know, now it's become more open. So I think we will see much more. But, you know, are people rude about others from elsewhere? I think so. I think ultimately it's a little bit like playground bullying. I always sort of think you can learn a lot about human society from the playground. And that's because a lot of people talk about certain behaviours as being childish. I don't view them as childish. I think they're human behaviours. I think the reason why people refer to them as being childish is because for most of us who've had a decent upbringing, these behaviours are knocked out of us during childhood. So we don't exhibit them as adults. But that's because we've been conditioned, not to. Dissuaded from certain behaviours, and but for some people they're not. So in the playground, for example, the bully, he'll bully you because you're too tall, but he'll also bully you because you're too short. He'll bully you because you're too fat, because you're too thin, because you're too clever, because you're too stupid. What is this bully ultimately doing? They're basically saying that they are the ideal, and that anyone who varies from their form is to be mocked. And it's a tribal behaviour, isn't it? So it's not just, about insults, as you say there, Scotland, Ireland, the Netherlands, I've not heard, but okay, and Spain and the French indeed, or Italians or whatever. It'll be about, people in a different county. It'll be, people even in a different town. Anything that basically says that you are the ideal, I think ultimately is where it stems from. But anyway, it sort of says here, I'm increasingly reminded of the decades when dumbing down was a fear in the UK. We seem to have embraced being thick as phony high culture. The dumbers are everywhere, dear old Auntie Beeb, on the internet, and our refusal to have a go at other people's languages and customs. The dumbed down lady who was surprised to see Spaniards in Spain is a case in point. Yes, I mean, I think there is, I think celebrity culture has a lot to answer for this. Yeah, I mean, it is a fact. I am a science teacher, for example, you know, and I have an interest in science, but I'll be perfectly honest. I know the names of more vacuous celebrities, and I don't watch television, but I just come into contact with them, and they're in my face. I can name you more airheaded celebrities than I can Nobel Prize winning scientists alive today that are around that have won their Nobel Prizes recently. You know, every year I read about the Nobel Prizes. I, you know, do a little special mini lesson with my classes about them. And the Ig Nobel Prizes, they're really good too. They're the precursor. And but I couldn't tell you the names of the people who've won those prizes. I don't know. They're not celebrities. Major scientists are not celebrities, even for people with an interest in science like myself. So we don't really have a culture of, you know, being inspired by intelligence or reason or anything like that. So that, yeah, it is a real worry. As for the languages, I mean, that's something that we're completely buggered on in this country because, you know, the governments have recognised this. They have recognised it's given us a competitive disadvantage not being able to speak other languages. And governments have sort of tried a bit. It's a bit half-hearted, you can argue, but we have sort of tried a bit. The problem is we do not have the teachers. You know, what we need is for every primary school to have a foreign language teacher. To teach as early as possible. As soon as we start school, should be learning a foreign language. The first couple of years of my schooling, I actually was in a private school. Then my parents realised it was actually bloody expensive. So it was only 2 years I got right at the start. But I was learning French. And then it just went. And I didn't, no one even attempted to teach me a foreign language for years after that. And that's the problem we have. So in this country, I mean, you know, if we really went for it, I'm sure, well, actually, it's very difficult in this post-Brexit because we would have to attract people from the continent, wouldn't we? Bit difficult in today's climate. But, you know, we'd have to do that. We'd have to put a lot of money into it and really go for it. And it always been a bit half-assed. But it's not easy to do now because we don't have enough people in the country that would be able to teach it. Because we need it done in primary. We need it very early on. Very early on. No good start, because at the moment in this country, we start a half-assed attempt to teach foreign languages from age 11, which is useless. Anyway, person describing themselves as a citizen of Merseyside constituency where everyone voted Labour, well, not everyone, but every constituency voted Labour and Remain. Yes, and as you say there, it's a no-go area for Johnson. Liverpool is absolutely a no-go area for Johnson, just like Scotland and as well. I mean, he got a fair amount of stick wherever he went, but certainly I saw the reaction when he went to Liverpool. But it is what it is, unfortunately. The country, I don't think it's grown racist. I just think that they have going to feel empowered as a result of feeling that they are now, they thought they were in the minority and they kept their views to themselves on that basis. It was just conforming, something humans naturally do. And now they think they're in the majority, so they're quite happy expressing these views. Expect to see an awful lot more tirades against people that are seen as outsiders being filmed on mobile phones and hopefully sent on to the police. All right, next one. So Nigel Farage has always said that there would be compromises and it wouldn't be straightforward. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. He said, and I quote, Brexit will be easy. He is one of the people who used the word easy, will be easy. And he didn't talk about compromises. If you believe he did, I am quite happy for you to show me a video of him in any interview describing the compromise we'd need to make prior to the 2016 Brexit referendum. because he didn't. It was from everyone. All the Brexiteers were on one page with this. It was going to be easy. Remember, the Brexiteers have been around for a very long time. You know, they weren't called Brexiteers then, of course, but, you know, the ones who wanted us to leave the EU have been around for decades. And they realised what their problem was. They were getting no traction, and the problem was that all of them wanted it for different reasons, which means their view of how Britain should emerge from leaving the EU was all very different. So they were working against each other. They realised this was fruitless. There already weren't enough of them. They needed to work together. How did they hit upon an idea to be able to work together? Simple. Don't talk about what Britain should do after leaving the EU. Only talk about leaving the EU. Just that. And that's something they could all agree on. And that's something they went through. They were all on the same page. Yes, they were all in different groups and different campaigns, but they all coordinated. They were all coordinating with each other. Even the likes of Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, who tried to give the impression that they were opposed to each other, really, in many ways. They were not. They were photographed having little shifty meetings in you know, fundraising events, and even a restaurant one time. You know, they were just publicly trying to keep, you know, away from each other. But they were all absolutely coordinated. It says, Nigel and the Tories have also stated quite a few projects that will create new jobs and bring economy to UK after Brexit, like the superports. Yeah, they won't. And when you say superports, there's no such thing. I think what you mean is free ports. Get on board. No, they won't. But hey, the Remainers will continue to focus on the negatives the whole while the Brexiteers are actually bracing themselves for what we know, always have known would be tricky, because this is the point of leaving. What the point of leaving was to give ourselves a tricky situation. Except when Freddie Mercury said that, this is a tricky situation, I've only got myself to blame. I don't think the Brexiteers are going to blame themselves. We don't want to be in a relationship with the government organisation who will nail our asses to the wall for mutual benefit. I don't even know what that last statement means, I'm sorry. But yeah, in terms of Brexiteers bracing themselves for what we need, no, they're embracing it. They're not bracing, they're embracing. They think it's going to be brilliant. They think the ones who really believe in it, the majority, not the ones I was just talking about before, who for them it's just the argument. You know, they just think all of a sudden it's going to be brilliant. And the problem is, like when you talk to any of these people and you say, okay, so what is the problem now? What is an issue now with being in the EU? They can never say. To this day, not a single Brexiteer, not one, has ever said a single thing that is bad about the EU. And the problem is, in order to say what's good about leaving the EU, you have to come up with something that's bad. Because at the end of the day, if the EU is bad for us, then it must be doing one of two things. Either imposing things onto us that we do not want, in which case it should be easy to name one. And in fact, you wouldn't leave for just one. There'd have to be a whole host of them. But if you should be able to at least name one. Or they're preventing us doing something that we would like to do. And again, that means you need to be able to name one thing that they're preventing us from doing. And they can't. You know, they can't at all. So, but it's one of these things. At the end of the day, any reasonable leaver, there's such a thing, but okay, let's say there is, has to just take the view that, well, we're just going to have to wait for 2 years and then the Remainers will see the light. And from our point of view, we just have to think to ourselves, do you know what? The lies have worked. They've worked on enough people to give Boris Johnson his majority. At any rate, it's not a majority of the people, but enough to give him his majority in Parliament. It's going to happen. There's no point moaning about that. It's going to happen. So we just now have to take the view, well, we need to wait a couple of years for them to, it might even be 1 year, but for some people, but for a, you know, a cumulative effect, we need to wait a couple of years. We need to wait 1 year for the end of what's supposed to be the transition period and see if Boris Johnson, because he's got his three options, he either extends the transition period, in which case that'll be a betrayal of what the Brexiteers think is going to happen. And that's ultimately what we need. The Brexiteers are going to be betrayed. They have to be. Because what we've been saying for the last few years is what they were promised is not possible. But until it's happened, we can't prove it's not possible. If you won't listen to the people who really know about these things, it's not possible. For some people, they have to see it with their own two eyes to believe a thing. And that means it has to happen. So he either extends the transition period, in which case that's the betrayal there. He crashes out with that deal, in which case we will see the effects of that, and then that will be that betrayal there. Or he will form a fully comprehensive trade deal, which in a year can only be done by basically signing up to the Norway-style deal, which, by the way, the Brexiteers were saying would be a cracking idea back in 2016, but not so much now. They don't want that now. And again, that's another example of how inconsistent Nigel Farage is. The idea, this person here is trying to demonstrate that Nigel Farage has been consistent. He hasn't been at all consistent. He was talking about how the Norway situation was an absolutely cracking situation. We should have that. Now he's dead against it. He doesn't want it at all. He said, of course we would be in the single market. Now he's saying, of course we should not be in the single market. There's no consistency at all. But yeah, so he has to do one of those three things. One of those three things. Every single one of them is a direct contradiction of what they were promised. And he has to do one of them. There isn't another option. So the first initial betrayal will come at the end of next year. Then a year after that, more will be evident. And we just have to wait for it. And if they think it's all going to be brilliant, then they just have to wait for us. Next one, it says, Ursula von der Leyen is coming to London next week to visit the PM. This suggests a shift in the power dynamic between the UK and EU, as previously our PM had pretty much have to go there. I'll leave the Farage comment for a moment. No, what it actually suggests is that you don't, I'm afraid, and I don't want to sound patronising, understand how international negotiations work. I'm afraid it is a current theme amongst Brexiteers. It doesn't represent a shift in the power dynamic. It represents the fact that UK will not be a member of the EU. In all international negotiations, actual face-to-face talks are always split between the two different nations or blocks, whatever. Obviously, there's a lot of trading blocks these days, so we tend to talk about blocks. During the withdrawal negotiations, the UK was a member of the EU. So we didn't go to the EU. We were part of the EU. So we went to Brussels. That's how it worked. Brussels and Strasbourg are the two places where EU business is conducted. And both sides of these negotiations were members of the EU. Now, of course, technically we still are, but we know we're definitely not going to be now. And these talks are all about getting ready for the talks that need to come when we're not a member of the EU. We are a third country. That means that, as is normal in all negotiations, doesn't matter how big or small a country is that's taking part in them, they are split between the two. That means that half of those talks will take place in the UK and half of them will take place in Brussels or Strasbourg, probably Brussels, as has typically been the case. And it's as simple as that. It's not a power shift. But again, the Brexiteers are so desperate to cling on to this fact that we get more power by leaving the EU that they're just clutching at straws. But I'm afraid, no, it doesn't represent that at all. And also, even the fact that sometimes some of these talks took place in London beforehand was only there really to shore up Theresa May's lack of power. They did it as a help, as a boost to her because she was doing so badly within her own party. They only came over just to give her a little bit of a boost because they wanted a sensible deal, and they knew full well that with the party or the government in the hands of someone more reckless, let's say, I don't know, Boris Johnson, would do something much more terrible. And it says, as for Farage, he's been one of the most influential British politicians of the past 50 years, like him or not, like Brexit or not. I would disagree. Now, I have never at all at any point doubted the fact that he's a very effective, dance performing monkey, basically. He's very effective rabble rouser, but he is not at all one of the most influential British politicians of the past 50 years. Brexit itself is the most seismic change to Britain that will have occurred, certainly in the last 50 years, for hundreds of years potentially. Well, maybe not. But certainly since the early 20th century. So if you're going to say Brexit is going to be the most seismic change to Britain in the last 50 years, yes. And if if what you're basing this statement on is that Farage basically caused it, then no. Lots of individuals contributed to Brexit. Farage was one of them. And I'll say this, without Nigel Farage, I don't think Brexit would have happened. That is true. But without Boris Johnson, I don't believe it would have happened. Without Michael Gove, wouldn't have happened. Without Aaron Banks, wouldn't have happened. You know, there are a number of people without who all contributed a small amount of influence. Without them, wouldn't have happened. Nigel Farage contributed a little bit. Remember, it only had to be a little bit to push it over. It was so tight. Every little bit of influence contributed. Nigel Farage's was not even the major contribution. The major contribution was, frankly, the money that paid for Cambridge Analytica and the decision to use them. That was the overwhelming... If you were to talk about one feature, one thing that swung that Brexit referendum, then that misinformation campaign, that stealing of data, that targeted information, that was it. And Nigel Farage wasn't responsible for that at any level. So, although he was influential in this seismic change, so many others were, and his was just a little bit. So although I can sort of see your line of thinking, I would have to disagree with that. Anyway, next one. Right, so this is where I was talking about the Conservatives or Boris Johnson's plans to do something for the North because he wants to retain the North. The reality for facing the Conservatives is this. Now, there's good and bad things to this if you are opposed to the Conservatives like myself. Now, on the one hand, Boris Johnson is going to stack the odds massively in his favour for the next general election. That includes massive sweeping changes to the boundaries, which will make it easier for him to get majorities. He will need a smaller minority to get changes. And remember, what he talked about in his manifesto is going to make these changes so that it was fairer. So it's like one person, one vote, everyone's vote counted the same. Well, here's the situation with that. If everyone's vote really does count for the same, then it would not be possible to form a government, a majority government in Parliament without a majority of the votes. But that is not going to happen. He's going to make it easier for his party. He's going to make it so Labour would have to, but he's going to make it so that his party can get an even smaller minority than he already got. He got about 43% of the vote. It was a bit under 43%, 42.7, I think. And got his whack, and not just a little majority, a big majority as well. And he wants to make it so that he can, with the same majority get the same minority get a larger majority in Parliament, or with a smaller minority get the same majority in Parliament, that sort of thing. So he's going to stack it in his own. There's other things he's doing as well. But on the other side, on the flip side, he's aware that something will have happened with Brexit by the time there's another general election. Has to. And that is going to cause a lot of problems for some people. And they're going to see that. Don't imagine we're going to get some blinding light on the road to Damascus from the whole country. It'll be like everywhere else in Europe. It'll swing decisively one way, but there'll still be a hell of a lot of people who'll still bang the drum for it. You've also got the problem that, increasingly aging population, the young people in this country really have turned very much off from the Conservatives. The sort of people that the Conservatives used to be able to rely on, they can't. I mean, Labour have lost a lot of their support. That they have a chance of getting that back. The Conservatives are really losing, the arguments. They're having to change their arguments fundamentally. They're still at war with themselves. Don't, think that this thumping majority for Johnson means that the Conservative Party are all healed. They are not. They'll give the distinct impression they are at the moment because they're riding high after this big majority. Those fractures will appear again. So, yes, the idea that the Conservatives will want to keep those seats in the North and that they will realise that they're going to have to throw some money at it, or at least pretend they have, is absolutely his plans. But as you say here, the Conservatives give with one hand and take away with the other. You just don't trust them, and this is true. And people have made this point, of course, the raising of the minimum wage effectively, even though they haven't raised it as much as they promised. They haven't even raised it as much as they promised back in 2015, but they've raised it, and they have raised it. And for the people for whom it matters, it's a significant increase as well. Just not good enough, but it is still significant. And they'll be happy with that. That will be getting some people on side. But as you also know, if they knacker the economy, then those people are going to find that that new money doesn't stretch as far. And actually, in real terms, they could end up poorer. In fact, very likely will. Or if they find it more difficult to get jobs, for example, then again, they literally will end up poorer. So yeah, these policies will give with one hand, take with the other. And another thing is this, when it comes to diverting funds to projects in the north, I can see, and I said this in the video and I can see this, it wouldn't surprise me if no new money came into these northern economies at all. That he said, oh, you know, we're spending he'll say we're spending all this money on projects in the north, and it'll be true, but most of that money, of course, will go into private hands and won't actually be spent in those economies. There'll be some, because it inevitably has to generate not only some jobs but some traffic through those northern areas. So there might be a bit of benefit, but it won't be anything like the sums he will quote come the next general election campaign. Next one. Okay. So in terms of Corbyn got what he wanted. He got Brexit done and the Conservatives to take the complete blame for it. I don't think he got what he wanted at all. He did get Brexit done and he wanted Brexit done. And we don't yet know that the Conservatives will take the complete blame for it. What he wanted was for the Conservatives to deliver Brexit, for them to tear each other to pieces, and then for him, or someone like him, to step over the ashes of the country and then reforge it in the image that he wants to see it reforged. He's not getting that. That's not happening. We do not yet know that the Conservatives are going to take any blame for it because it still has not happened. Remember, people have already seen a great deal of damage caused by Brexit. It's all been there for them to see for themselves. And a lot of people will not accept it. It's a minority now, but it's still a massive minority still. And if they won't accept it now, I don't want to make the assumption that they suddenly will see the light, when Brexit happens. Many won't. Face facts, many won't. The hope is that a significant and a decisive number do. That's the hope. That no lies, because the lies are going to get worse. The social media manipulation is going to get worse. The media manipulation is going to get worse. The hope is that people see it and realise, and no amount of misinformation will blind them to what is actually happening to themselves. So Corbyn on no level has won, because I don't think that even Corbyn wanted the UK to leave the EU and allow the Conservatives to reforge that post-Brexit nation. He has given them a blank cheque for the Conservatives, not for Labour, not for his Labour, for Boris Johnson's Conservatives to reshape the Constitution and the country in a way that potentially, even if Labour do get in next time, they will not be able to unpick in the time that will be available to them. Because that is the problem. It is a lot quicker to destroy than it is to build. So no, he hasn't got what he wanted. I think, he is not happy with how things have turned out. I don't know. I still to this day will not know, and maybe I'll never know. Going into that general election, did he really think he was going to win? Or was he still thinking, let the Conservatives win so they can deliver Brexit, make a mess of everything, and then we can come in and rule for 50 years or whatever? Either way, he was desperately deluded. Desperately deluded. Last one. No, oh God, I've got rid of it. Sorry, there we go. So, talking here about Euroscepticism on the wane in Europe at large, outside of the UK. Because I doubt we've seen the end of Euroscepticism. No, I did actually say in the video, I will just point this out, that even the polls were suggesting 61% in favour of the EU, which is greater than normal. That's still a massive number, over a third, in fact, pretty much 2/5, that are either not sure or are not. So don't get me wrong, Euroscepticism will always be there, because it's a very easy thing for populists to do. Blame the outsider. And the EU, maddeningly, for the whole of the EU, is the outsider. It's really weird, isn't it? Because the EU is this cohesive force, and yet it can also be seen by populists as the outsider. But it says here, Farage will work with some, the far right, Wilders, Le Pen, Orban and Silvani. But effective Euroscepticism is dead, to be fair. Now the Eurosceptics will come close to Farage. Right. I don't think they will work with Farage for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think they will recognise he hasn't got any great insight. The people who sort of ran the campaigns wasn't Nigel Farage. He was a front man. He was, he's a PR guy. Think of Nigel Farage as not being a leader, because he's not, but as the PR guy. He was the one who was able to come across as being credible in front of a camera. Able to get ordinary people to believe that he was just an ordinary chap with his pint in one hand and his fag in the other. He built up a party of exclusively multimillionaires. Exclusively multimillionaires. And managed to somehow con people into thinking it was a party for the working person. I mean, but the campaigning wasn't his. He didn't make those decisions. He just went out there and said things and banged on with his sound bites. And the other reason is, like in America, he can go, and speak for Donald Trump at his rallies, and that can work. I don't think that quite works the same in other European countries, because he won't be able to speak Dutch or French or Italian. He can't communicate. He is a foreigner. He will be a foreigner. He's a foreigner in America as well, but he can talk the talk. He can speak the language at least. Whereas, in these other countries, he is just a foreigner. So they won't work with him. They'll work with the people who masterminded his campaign. They'll work with Steve Bannon, I've no doubt at all. And probably already are. But yeah, Euroscepticism won't ever see the end of it. Never. There will always be opposition to everything. It's just like, the end of the Second World War didn't end Nazism. That continues. We have our neo-Nazis these days. And have for some time, and always will. You will never finish an idea, because there are so many people with hate in their hearts and they want someone to hate. And, they will always find someone. But anyway, that's this week's Political Postbox. Hope you found it interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then also please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.